Hello, everyone. I'm Donna Fiducia.
And I'm Don Neuen, and this is Cowboy Logic Radio.
Cowboys didn't dance, didn't wear designer shirts. When their hearts were filled with memories, their bodies filled with hurt. They would sit around the campfire and exchange a piercing glaze. Back when the West was really wild, cowboys didn't dance.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Donna Fiducia.
And I'm Don Neuen. Welcome to this week's episode of Cowboy Logic Radio.
We're not going to discuss Donald Trump's tweets, the NFL, monuments, or Antifa.
Although we do want to remind you that while all of the pathetic topics that Donna just mentioned are consuming the MSN headlines, Donna and I want you to focus your attention to Puerto Rico.
The citizens of Puerto Rico are experiencing devastation that is not measurable. In addition to the physical damage that Hurricane Maria brought to Puerto Rico is the fact that their entire electric grid basically no longer exists.
Yeah, Puerto Rico has been thrown into the dark ages. On previous Cowboy Logic radio shows, we have discussed in depth the electric grid and the catastrophic effect the destruction of our electric grid would have on the American people.
Our previous guests, such as Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, Claire Lopez, James Hyde, and Major General Paul Vallely, have discussed the terrifying effects on our society an EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, would deliver.
Our planet, and more specifically, the United States, is extremely susceptible to an EMP blast, either from a solar burst or from a nuclear detonation.
North Korea, Iran, China, Russia, Pakistan, all enemies of the United States, all possess the technology needed to detonate an EMP above the Earth's atmosphere that would instantly collapse the United States electrical grid.
Yeah, but Donna, equally as terrifying, and maybe more so, is an EMP blast from a non-enemy, the sun. And we are long past due.
A solar EMP blast from the sun or coronal mass injection could cause damage to the United States that would instantly send all of us back to the mid-1800s. What would you do?
Well, the threat of an EMP attack is very real. It is very serious. It's not a matter of if, but when. Again, we are long overdue, Donna.
Experts say that if the United States is hit with either a solar or a nuclear EMP, 90% of the population would die within 1 year. A 90% death rate, almost guaranteed.
We'd have complete civil unrest, starvation, lack of medical treatment, lack of medical supplies, lack of medicine, lack of drinking water, lack of fuel, lack of communication. Everything that you have become reliant on will cease to exist.
For years, Don and I have been talking about this subject, and the most terrifying aspect of an EMP is the United States government has not protected our grid.
Yeah, but we've got the technology to harden and protect our electrical grid. What would the cost be? Someplace between $2 billion and $20 billion.
And that sounds like a great deal of money until you see what our federal government wastes every year, in fact, every month.
Yeah. Donna, during the Obama reign, we released $150 billion in frozen funds to Iran, one of the greatest threats of an EMP attack on America. Please explain to me how this makes any sense at all.
It makes zero sense.
Well, tonight's Cowboy Logic radio show is dedicated to the electromagnetic pulse, an EMP.
First, we'll play for you an excellent documentary from Nat Geo on EMPs. This documentary features one of our recent guests, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, one of the leading experts on EMPs.
And then in hour two, we will be joined by Dr. Peter Vincent Pry for a full hour of his wisdom, insight, and advice regarding EMPs.
So sit back, feel free to take notes as we spend the next 2 hours discussing a very real, very terrifying threat to all of us, the electromagnetic pulse.
It may be the most powerful weapon you've never heard of. A sudden burst of electromagnetic energy that destroys anything electric in the blink of an eye. The power grid. Computer control systems. Radio communication. All stop. It can come from nature or from an enemy. It doesn't matter. The result is the same. With little or no warning, life as you know it will end. What would you do if you found out an EMP, electromagnetic pulse attack, is imminent? Would you know what to do? Now, discover the science behind the headlines, the intelligence world leaders need to know, in the briefing that uncovers electronic Armageddon. Imagine you've just become leader of your nation. You receive word that a nuclear warhead is detected in the atmosphere. The crew of the E-6 Mercury, located at Patuxent River Naval Air Station, is already in action. They are your first line of defense in case of nuclear disaster. At a moment's notice, they secure airborne communication between you and your military leaders. The rocket carrying this weapon climbs higher than expected, pushing beyond the atmosphere. It now has the sign of an EMP, electromagnetic pulse bomb. The nuclear warhead will detonate high above the Earth's surface. And people on the ground will not feel a thing. Powerful electromagnetic waves destroy electrical circuits. One of the most wired nations in the world will go dark. This plane is especially designed to survive an EMP.
Execute the scramble launch. Intel 200.
It may be one of the only means of communication you, as Commander-in-Chief, will have to your military forces. In a matter of months, our 21st century technology-driven world will be catapulted back to a non-electrified time. This is the worst-case scenario, but one that could happen on your watch. With the fate of millions resting in your hands, will you be prepared for the aftermath? To make the right decisions, you need to know more about electromagnetic pulses, how they work, the damage they incur, what you should not be scared of, and what you should. To help you separate the physics from the fiction is a briefing led by physicist Richard Muller.
An EMP bomb is a bomb that's designed to go above the atmosphere. And you're releasing suddenly all this huge energy. A few percent of that energy is in the form of gamma rays. Gamma rays are essentially X-rays that have much greater energy. You take an X-ray, which is maybe 10,000 volts of energy, and instead give it 1,000,000 volts of energy, and we call it a gamma ray. These gamma rays then spread out. They'll hit to the horizon.
When the gamma rays hit the atmosphere, they bump into nitrogen and oxygen molecules, knocking off electrons and creating electric current in space.
Electrons moving through a wire, what we call an electric current. Electrons moving through space are an electric current in space.
As this current moves through the Earth's magnetic field, it emits microwaves that strike the surface with an intense surge of power.
That's what makes it so damaging, the fact that it's coming in a very narrow pulse.
In less than a billionth of a second, the electrical intensity on Earth's surface becomes so hot, microchips fry, power lines overload, and the electric grid collapses.
Everything with microelectronics in it stops. Your car, your computer, the subway, there's no electricity. And if you think about it, if you don't have any electricity, you don't have anything in our infrastructure, do you?
It would change the game. It would change the world order.
Look around you and imagine what life would be like in a world without power. It's an electronic Armageddon. There are two possible sources that can trigger a massive electromagnetic pulse. Naturally, by solar storms, or man-made by a nuclear bomb. Who could create such a weapon and use it against the United States is a matter of much debate. But the technology exists. A single nuclear warhead exploded in the upper atmosphere could wipe out your nation's electric grid. It's a weapon of mass destruction with a twist. How much damage our high-tech world would sustain is unknown. It's never been experienced in the digital age. The bomb that leveled Hiroshima was 13 kilotons. Detonated at 1,900 feet altitude, well within Earth's atmosphere.
It was the heat from it that basically caused a firestorm in the city that caused most of the damage. A burst on the surface will produce more blast in the immediate area, and will also generate more fallout downwind from the burst. A nuclear burst above the atmosphere has quite different effects.
It would take a much larger bomb, in the megaton range, exploded much higher, around 300 miles altitude, to create an EMP large enough to shut down infrastructure in a country the size of the United States.
It's the only way of using a nuclear weapon that could give rogue states or states like Iran the ability to win a war with the United States.
1 in 50 Americans may know about EMP, but I will assure you that 100% of our potential enemies know all about EMP.
Some experts fear that Iran and North Korea are developing a large EMP bomb.
Iran writes specifically about taking the United States out by means of a nuclear electromagnetic pulse attack. It has practiced launching missiles off a vessel in the Caspian Sea, so it would not require an ICBM to do this.
In 2009, international intelligence sources claimed that North Korea assembled a medium-range missile with a nuclear warhead capable of reaching South Korea. In this satellite image, North Korea is mostly dark, a stark contrast to South Korea. If North Korea detonates an EMP bomb and the gamma rays spread over their country, the effect would hardly be noticed. But in South Korea, where 10 million people in Seoul alone depend heavily on microchips, the pulse would instantly level the playing field between the two longtime enemies. The likelihood of an EMP attack and how much damage it actually causes is subject to fierce debate among scientists and defense experts.
I don't see any evidence, looking at their statements in the last decade, that they would actually risk bringing ruin on their country, because they know the U.S. has a defense in-depth capability that could strike back rather easily.
conceal your identity, by giving a missile and a weapon to a terrorist group, putting it on a freighter, and firing it off the coast of the United States.
After the missile is launched, the ship is sunk. So there are now no fingerprints.
You wouldn't even have bomb debris, so that you'd be able to do forensic analysis to figure out which country the bomb came from.
Yes, it's possible, but a lot of things are going to have to work perfectly for the perpetrator to get away with this without leaving evidence.
While predictions are difficult, some scientists fear that a well-placed EMP would cripple our high-tech way of life. None of our infrastructures are immune, including transportation.
Anything that has a microchip in it is vulnerable to the EMP. There's a particular danger for airplanes. We've known for years that lightning can strike airplanes, so we've designed circuits that are safe against that kind of a strike.
Lightning only strikes in a single spot, but an EMP strike can affect large areas all at once.
It can leak through the protection that we have on these electronic circuits. As a result, an airplane could be very difficult, maybe even impossible to fly after it's been hit.
All the circuits are blown. Nothing works. With thousands of planes crisscrossing the United States each day, for example, how many will continue to fly? Without warning, hundreds could simultaneously fall from the sky. Military scientists first witnessed the threat posed by an EMP in 1962, when they exploded a 1.4 megaton hydrogen bomb above the Pacific Ocean. The test was called Starfish Prime.
Many rocket payloads were prepared for firing into and around the weapon detonation area to obtain data on the fundamental physics of the burst phenomena.
Several mysterious things happened in the Hawaiian Islands at the time the Starfish was detonated.
Some of the streetlights went out.
Burglar alarms going off.
There was a microwave communications link that failed.
Telephone signals being stopped.
These things had to be reported, so we're fairly sure we didn't get all of the information.
3 months later, the Soviet Union launches Operation K, a series of large-yield, high-altitude tests detonated over central Kazakhstan. The scientific results of the testing remain classified, but accounts of extensive and widespread damage are well known. Communication systems shorted out. Power lines failed. One of the damaged lines was rumored to be 400 miles long. If the same tests were performed today, the damage could be far worse.
A very important thing to know is that in the 1960s, everything was tube technology instead of solid states.
The vacuum tubes that were used in electronics in the 1960s were largely resistant to an EMP because they were big, spread apart, and could handle high voltages. Unlike the miniature semiconductors that make up today's microchips, 1 billion of these fragile components could fit into a single vacuum tube. One EMP pulse easily fries the cluster.
If you put, 10,000 volts over a big gap, you may get a spark, may not. But you put it over a small gap, and you will get a spark in which a huge amount of power goes very quickly through some of your chip and basically burns it out.
Scientists like Bill Radosky and his team of electrical engineers have fried their share of motherboards, trying to understand an EMP's destructive power.
We got the right resistor string in there?
To interfere with those voltage level of normal communications within the equipment, you have to put a higher voltage on top of that signal, or it won't be noticed.
And we'll be shooting at 2K 2000 volts. Okay, pulser's charged. I'm gonna shoot it. There it is.
Looks good.
Okay, yeah, got the whole thing. Got the current, got the voltage.
Their experiments show that the size of the circuitry determines how vulnerable it is.
Typical chips operate at, it used to be 5 volts, 3 volts. I think now some are 1.8 volts.
Okay, do you want to go at it higher, see if we can get a bigger arc, draw more current?
Let's keep that one and go up 500 volts.
Okay.
See if we can see that spike better.
When blasted with a sudden pulse, arcs are created inside the electronics that can jump very short distances between chips, causing multiple burnouts.
And that's what makes the pulses so dangerous.
Charged, I'm gonna shoot it.
Whoa, there was smoke there.
It only takes one chip to act as an antenna for the electromagnetic pulse to destroy the entire board. The implications could be catastrophic. Financial networks, medical records, telecommunications. All the engines that drive modern society are run by microchips. And in this lab, they proved to be defenseless against an EMP.
With EMP, many pieces would fail simultaneously in different parts of the infrastructure. Today, we don't have a plan to deal with that.
The entire country depends on the electrical grid for power. A fragile labyrinth of high-voltage power lines patched together over the last 50 years. Parts of it are old and overburdened. A single line failure can cause cascading blackouts over massive areas. Could the grid in its current state survive an EMP?
These are thousands of miles of power transmission lines, and those all act like great EMP antennas.
These antennas spring forth from a series of major power suppliers. One of the largest is the Hoover Dam. Located on the border of Nevada and Arizona, its hydroelectricity sprawls out over the Southwest, providing power to over 1 million people in cities as far away as Los Angeles. The power plant is located at the base of the dam, cut deep inside the canyon walls. 17 generators connect to the turbines below and produce 4.2 billion kilowatt hours a year. There's no evidence that these generators will be shut down by an EMP, but what happens next is where potential disaster lies. The electricity is sent out at a high voltage by transformers traveling along miles of transmission lines. Then converts down to a lower voltage for use in your home. When an EMP strikes, the electricity flow is hit with an enormous surge of power, building up as it courses the length of the transmission line. When it reaches the end, the high current has nowhere to go but directly into the transformer.
Hundreds of amperes that the transformers aren't balanced to take care of. What happens is it's ripped apart by the other power that's going through, which is now thrown out of whack. And it just destroys itself.
Our chief vulnerability are these big transformers, and if you lose them, you've basically lost the whole grid. And they're not manufactured in this country anymore. You're talking about 18 months to replace one transformer. And this country can't survive for 18 months. It probably can't survive for 6 months without electricity.
As leader, one of the first things you need to consider is food. Without electricity, how many of your citizens starve to death? Technology alone makes the United States among the world's most efficient producers of food. But if the automation stops, there's nothing left for trucks to deliver.
In the average city, there are 3 days' supply of food. What will you do?
Steuben Foods in Elma, New York provides daily nutritional needs for over 200,000 people.
2% of our population is devoted to producing food for 100%. And it's dependent on factories like this that are large in size, dependent on inputs from far away. We distribute across the country. So as you can imagine, that same efficiency also makes us vulnerable.
It's literally about life and death, as corny as that may sound.
Schwartz asks engineer Lee Pearson if it's possible to keep his plant running after an EMP event.
It turned out to be a very interesting challenge. As you can see around you, we have a lot of equipment, and it's like links in a chain. Whether we are receiving milk, pasteurizing it, packaging it, putting it on a truck, shipping it, all of that is dependent on technology. Most of our equipment is computer controlled, lots of instrumentation. All of those would be sensitive to the effects of EMP. I need a year's worth of parts. I needed a way to protect our electronic equipment. We are likewise very dependent on inputs from the outside, whether it's electricity, natural gas, water. We have a place to send our sewage. So as you can see, it's quite a huge challenge, and turned out perhaps it's beyond our capability to do easily here. Who's in charge of food in an emergency such as that? You know, is martial law take over?
EMP attacks don't kill people immediately. In a matter of days, they'll start to run out of water. In a matter of weeks, they will starve once supplies are gone, and there'll be anarchy.
If an electromagnetic pulse attacks on your watch, and the electrical grid experienced a long-term failure, do you know what a national blackout would mean? What happens to a city like Las Vegas? Synonymous with around-the-clock action in an electrified oasis. The casinos that drive the economy go dark. Business stops. If looters ransack stores, the televisions they steal no longer work. Over 100,000 tourists in high-rise hotels stumble down darkened stairways. And transportation stops in a place where everything needed to live is shipped in. But none of that matters if over 500,000 people suddenly realize they are trapped in a city surrounded by nothing but desert. Their nearest water supply 30 miles away at Lake Mead.
All of our population is now dependent on the electric pump for water and on water for purification systems. And all of this would go away in the aftermath of an EMP attack that destroyed the infrastructures.
Can I have a drink?
Survival without water is nearly impossible after 3 days.
Try to get a scoop with your hands, Toby.
How long would it take before an average city's tap ran dry?
I want some.
This is serious. Within days, we'd be sustaining casualties.
How's it going, John? Everything quiet?
Yes, sir.
Ron Zegers runs operations at the Southern Nevada Water Authority.
We have to pump water from a very low elevation to a high elevation. Our electric bill is probably in the range of 40 to 60 million annually.
It takes 30 high-pressure pumping stations to keep water flowing. If the electric grid fails and backup generators run out of fuel, these pumps simply stop working. Any clean water left in storage tanks, Zegers estimates, will last about 100 days.
Our customers probably have close to 1 billion gallons worth of water stored in their system that can gravity feed the system and maintain pressure for a period of time.
But for many at higher elevations, a gravity-fed system is useless, and they'll be out of water within a day.
You now have 300,000 people that are living in motels. How do you provide service to that group?
It's only a matter of time before the desert reclaims her jewel. A world of starvation, death, and disease springs forth in its place. Even the remaining water supply becomes contaminated because computer systems that control water treatment fail. Most water treatment plants are run by a SCADA system. SCADA stands for Supervised Controller Data Acquisition, a small computer at the heart of most infrastructure control centers. If it burns out, water purification ceases here immediately.
SCADA is just a computer. Here's this SCADA. Deep inside are these microcircuits. And you have these small gaps where you have electrodes close to each other. And now you're piling up huge numbers of electrons on them. You're getting thousands of volts across circuits that were only designed to hold 1 or 2 volts. And so you get sparking inside the SCADA. The circuit is burned out. You've killed the supervisory control.
And they're pervasive. They're not just in the electric grid. They're in all the critical infrastructures. They play a crucial role in air traffic control, locomotive switching stations, the pipelines that deliver gas, natural gas, and gasoline to plants, and fuel oil. Valves are run by SCADAs. You know, the motors that deliver these things are run by SCADAs. They run traffic lights. They're everywhere.
We've never experienced an EMP, and the consequences of an EMP are potentially so extensive that we have to be right the first time.
EMP specialist Jerry Lubell uses the private sector's largest simulator to understand the pulse's impact on microcircuitry that's inside things like traffic lights and automobiles.
This pulsar is charged up to approximately 300,000 volts, and it's discharged very, very rapidly. And when it's discharged, it sends a large surge of current through that wire and up this antenna. And when the current surges up the antenna radiates a very, very large simulated electromagnetic pulse out into this test volume. And that electromagnetic pulse is incident on the controller box and causes the stoplight to go into a permanent blinking red mode. And all of that happens in well under 1 billionth of a second. On a modern automobile, there can be up to about 90 microprocessors in the car, and these are all wired together in a network.
Charging. 3, 2, 1, fire.
1 in 10 cars lose power instantly after being zapped.
Charging. 3, 2, 1, fire.
In a different test lab, Lubell and the engineers at L3 use a small pulsar to test their latest prototype. A physical barrier that could protect the digital backbone of 21st century civilization from catastrophe. A way to protect the internet. The web is made up of a vast network of mainframe computers, all powered by electricity. So Lubell's team looks for a way to harden the metal boxes that house the millions of servers around the world. In the event of an EMP, at least some internet traffic could continue to flow. Hardening means protecting electrical devices from powerful overloads, the kind that an electromagnetic pulse delivers. It is most commonly called a Faraday cage, named after the man who invented it. A Faraday cage is basically a continuous metal box that absorbs or reflects energy, keeping electronics inside safe from sudden pulses. Lubell's lab itself acts like a giant Faraday cage. The seamless copper protects electronics in his building from being zapped by the simulator.
Charge him. And fire.
But this simple concept can't work in the real world.
We cannot build a perfect Faraday cage. It has to have holes in it. Power is absolutely essential in the cabinet in order to be able to energize the internal electronics. And that power is effectively a penetration through the Faraday cage. And the way it's protected is with filters, custom designed specifically for this application. The advantage of this kind of an approach is that anything inside the cabinet does not have to be hardened.
Hardening critical equipment for the military became a central focus during the height of the Cold War. A handful of essential aircraft were designed in direct response to the looming specter of an EMP attack. Both the Soviet Union and the United States believed EMP would signal the first strike in a full-scale nuclear war, a knockout blow paralyzing the other's ability to communicate with their nuclear forces and order retaliation.
Fire!
In the 1980s, the U.S. built a fully shielded airborne command post. At least one E-6 is in the air at all times. It's designed like a giant Faraday cage.
Every hinge and jointed area of the aircraft is bonded together in multiple places for all electricity to flow smoothly from one panel to another. Hydraulic lines and the other fuel lines in the aircraft also are bonded electrically to the aircraft frame to ensure that electricity does not build up on them and then enter the aircraft that way. And then the openings of the aircraft, all the windows are protected by EMP shields.
The antennas used to ensure communication between Central Command and distant forces present a problem because they themselves act like EMP conductors.
We have over 50 antennas on the aircraft, and all the wiring from that has to come into the aircraft for us to accomplish our mission. So all of our external antennas and wiring all feeds into these devices, which ground out any energy coming into the aircraft.
The longest one drops from the belly of the plane, extending for 5 miles, giving commanders the ability to transmit orders to nuclear subs deep in the ocean.
For an adversary that might think that EMP would be a way to cripple the United States' ability to communicate to its forces, this aircraft exists to prevent that contingency as well as others.
As a leader, you may stop enemies from using an EMP bomb. But when the attack comes from nature, what will you do? How do you stop the sun from delivering a fatal electric blow?
Closely related to the EMP is the danger of a natural kind of EMP we call a geomagnetic storm. This originates in the sun. The sun sends its solar wind. If it comes out in a very big burst, that disturbs the magnetic field of the Earth in a way that can also affect our critical infrastructure.
Infrastructure doesn't care if it's being attacked by a nuclear EMP or by an EMP from a geomagnetic storm.
The result is the same. The grid is the victim. They've hit the Earth before, and they will hit again. In 1859, British astronomer Richard Carrington recorded seeing 2 very dark, ominous spots grow on the sun's surface. 2 days later, the New York Times reported sightings of brilliant auroras at the equator. Auroras are caused when electrons carried by solar winds are trapped in the Earth's magnetic field.
Magnetism comes from deep inside of the Earth, where there are enormous electric currents flowing in the metal core. This creates a magnetic field that comes out near the north, wraps around, and comes back in to the south. You watch an aurora, you're watching the electrons following the magnetic field lines down into the atmosphere of the Earth. When they come into the Earth's atmosphere, they bump into the nitrogen and the oxygen, and they knock electrons off, and that makes the color, it makes the light. Now, in 1859, people saw this happening near the equator. That means the magnetic field was completely disturbed. In modern days, a huge magnetic storm like that could cause a great deal of problems that didn't exist in the pre-electric days.
Telegraphs went haywire, overflowing with electric current.
Some of those telegraph systems and stations actually burned down.
Scientists of the day had never seen anything like it and had no idea that events on the sun can directly impact Earth.
Go ahead with the 75 amp test.
John Kappenman has spent years conducting tests on the modern power grid, simulating the EMP effect of a large geomagnetic storm.
When I started working in this area, we never thought that geomagnetic storms would truly be large enough to actually damage large power transformers.
Then came the storm of 1989. All of Quebec went dark.
They went from normal operating conditions to complete province-wide blackout in 92 seconds. So fast they couldn't even assess what was going on, let alone take any sort of meaningful human intervention. We not only experienced a blackout in a major portion of the North American power grid, but we damaged some transformers as well. Something that easily could be 10 times worse is likely to occur at some point in the future. I mean, they have occurred before, they will occur again.
While they cannot stop them, scientists are on constant alert for signs that the next big one is headed our way. At the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, Doug Biesecker looks for extreme changes on the surface of the sun that could signal the onset of a massive solar storm.
We're watching activity on the sun to be able to forecast the impact it will have here on Earth. And so we're looking for things like solar flares and coronal mass ejections.
A coronal mass ejection, or CME, is what triggers a geomagnetic storm. Plasma shoots off the surface of the sun and is carried by solar winds toward Earth. Large CMEs are very rare, but they happen, and they can deliver the same destructive punch as an electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear explosion. But instead of a bomb, the energy comes from the sun.
What we're going to see in this simulation is an eruption from the sun. First we'll see a bright flash, the photons that get here at 8 minutes, and then there's a puff of the protons, and now our cloud that's going to cause our geomagnetic storm, the CME. It's going to take 1, 2, 3 days to get here.
That's enough time for Biesecker and his team to issue warnings.
I'd like to report a geomagnetic sudden impulse.
Air traffic controllers will reroute planes.
Solar flux 70.
And power operators will trigger a controlled shutdown of the grid in an attempt to minimize damage. The first warning is from an early side effect of a massive solar flare.
Before that CME gets here, there's another effect, a proton storm.
The proton storm is picked up by NASA satellites stationed between the sun and the Earth.
We can see the proton storm hitting this detector, and that's the increased noise we see in the detector.
If the proton storm continues onto Earth,
the Earth's magnetic field just starts to go crazy.
that's when a different team of scientists take over. The USGS and their ground-based instruments are the first to indicate that a geomagnetic storm has hit the Earth. Jeffrey Love monitors these gauges called magnetometers that read the Earth's magnetic pulse once every second. The instruments are housed in remote areas far away from electronic interference. Any metal can disturb the magnetic field.
By measuring the magnetic field at the surface of the Earth at observatories, we can infer what's going on in space above our heads.
He studies fluctuations that happen when solar winds blow charged particles toward Earth.
The solar wind is a hot plasma. It's electrically conducting. Electrical conductors interact with magnetic fields. So when the solar wind arrives at the magnetosphere, because it is an electrical conductor, it exerts a pressure on the magnetosphere, compressing it on the day side, extending it on the night side.
Love plots the impact of solar weather on Earth's magnetic field, helping to anticipate incoming storm effects, which is a good thing. According to a report from the National Academy of Sciences, if a massive storm hits Earth, full recovery of the infrastructure could take up to 10 years.
During that time, the level of human misery and destruction and death, people would really perish.
And it's not just major urban areas that are affected.
What happens in a typical small town the day after, 1 second after an EMP event?
Author Bill Fortune decides to find out.
Okay, let's go with the cars. Action, action, action!
He convinces his neighbors in the small town of Black Mountain, North Carolina, to stage their own electromagnetic pulse disaster exercise.
Hey, come back! I'm dead.
They anticipate that cars with microchips and fuel injectors will fail,
Sorry, you okay?
and pepper the street with a few older models they know will still run.
Why is his car still working?
Bob Miller comes riding up here in his old car, and he's coming up the street, and a bunch of other people don't like it. His car runs and theirs don't. I mean, that's going to happen.
In all the emergency events that we've dealt with over the years, we always knew that it was going to be a short window that we were going to have to operate in. In this event, I think that's one of the key components that we do need to be focused on, is we have no idea what the time frame is going to be before resources are able to come in, and that's all going to depend on how big of an area that this actually affected.
Around Highland Farms, I think they added some water up here.
It's nearly impossible for first responders to predict a time frame, because without electricity, how do you rebuild an electrical society?
Within a matter of days, you're going to have perhaps tens, maybe hundreds of millions of people on the road looking for water, looking for food, looking for shelter.
More than cars, more than airplanes, more than the internet, an EMP will knock out the food and water supply. Then what? Within days, supplies run out. And people leave their homes in a desperate search for food.
The simulation that was going on up there was to give out food and to give out water. We had a water supply. We had a creek that was coming in, and we have a small lake up there. So we had a built-in water source.
Okay, 1 gallon per family. There you go. Take that back to your mommy and daddy, okay? Hi, everybody. Thanks, Tom. How's the chlorine levels?
Some purification could be done to that, to a natural resource that already existed.
How are we doing on water?
Need some water?
Okay, can we go back to the stream and get some more water, guys? Thanks.
What seems to be going on with you?
Within 5 to 10 days, because of water pollution and sanitation issues, you will have millions of people falling ill from gastrointestinal illnesses.
We need to get a body temp, get some bottles on her.
And I could foresee a scenario where the town says, look, we have 5,000 people. We only have enough food to feed us all for 30 days.
All right.
How many?
Over here, 2 lines. 2 lines. How many in the family?
3.
3. 1.
If we open up and let the 50,000 people coming in on the interstates walking into our town, we now only have enough food for 3 or 4 days, and then we all starve together. Do you want to make those choices?
The simulation at Black Mountain is a worst-case scenario. Permanent failure of the grid. But it's the worst-case scenario that could happen to your country. Many believe that the grid is the linchpin, and protecting it from both man and nature is imperative.
With technologies that are here now, we can do a whole lot to harden the grid so that we aren't this vulnerable. And being this vulnerable just invites attack.
An opportunity to defend critical infrastructure from an EMP may be on the horizon. Strategies to modernize miles of aging power lines, increase transmission efficiency, and add renewable energy sources are all part of a master plan to create a high-tech smart grid.
The conversation about EMP is one that needs to be commensurate with the deployment of the smart grid.
For EMP experts, hardening any addition to the grid may be the only way to prevent catastrophic failure.
We have the opportunity to take into account the danger of the EMP. We can put in backup transformers and other devices so that at least the grid will not be so dangerously susceptible to the EMP.
It is a dual dilemma. The technology that makes us so powerful may ultimately be our Achilles heel. Without electronics, infrastructures grind to a halt, and civilization as we know it ends. Now that you know what is vulnerable and what isn't, what will you do?
Cowboys didn't dance, didn't wear designer shirts. Their hearts were filled with memories, their bodies filled with hurt. They would sit around the campfire and exchange a piercing glance. Back when the West was really wild, cowboys didn't dance, yes. When cowboys didn't dance, didn't wear designer shirts. When their hearts were filled with memories, their bodies filled with hurt. They would sit around the campfire and exchange a piercing glance, yes. Back when the West was really wild, cowboys didn't dance.
Check us out on the web at cowboylogic.us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Donna Fiducia.
And I'm Don Neuen. And this is Cowboy Logic Radio.
Cowboys didn't dance, didn't wear designer shirts. When their hearts were filled with memories, their bodies filled with hurt. They would sit around the campfire and exchange a piercing glance, yes. Back when the West was really wild, cowboys didn't dance.
Welcome back to Cowboy Logic Radio. I'm Donna Fiducia, along with Don Neuen, and our very special guest is Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. Now, it's been a few years since we've had Dr. Pry on, But if you don't know what an EMP is, electromagnetic pulse, and how it can affect your very life, you better listen up, because if we do get hit with an EMP, we're back into the 1880s. You're basically living like the Amish. And we are seriously unprotected, and Dr. Peter Vincent Pry is at the forefront of trying to wake up the country about this. Your chief of staff right now, the EMP Commission, and Dr. Pry will get to that in a moment. I'm very happy to say that the Trump administration seems to be looking more at this. And you are a former CIA analyst. You've addressed the Senate Armed Services Committee. You've addressed, last time we talked, a number of state legislatures on this problem as well. And 3 books that you can find in the usual spots: Blackout Wars, Apocalypse Unknown, and Electric Armageddon, to just name a few. And that pretty much sums it up. Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, welcome back to Cowboy Logic Radio. It's been way too long.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, let me see. It's been a couple of years, and are we in any better shape as far as protecting the grid than we were before?
Well, we are. There has been definite progress that's been made. For example, the Congress has passed the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act just this last year, which is a huge step forward. It's one of the core recommendations that the Congressional EMP Commission made, and it creates a new national planning scenario. It directs the Department of Homeland Security to add a new national planning scenario. There's like 15 canonical national planning scenarios: earthquakes, a terrorist bomb goes off in a city, cyber attacks, chemical and biological warfare. But there was never an EMP national planning scenario, and so that kept it off the radar screen for federal, state, and local emergency planners, who basically didn't have to do anything, because the national planning scenarios drive all of our planning and preparation and resource allocation. But now that's changed. So federal, state, and local governments will have to start preparing for an EMP event, to recover from an EMP event, and to try to save our people from one. It also requires the Department of Homeland Security to reach out to the states to help them, and the states can reach out to the Department of Homeland Security and ask for help, and should get it under this. So that's enormous progress. And then at the state level, also there's a consciousness now. I mean, on a bipartisan basis, both the Senate and the House. Democrats and Republicans are not united on much of anything, except they are united on this. The Critical Infrastructure Protection Act passed unanimously, and all of the EMP efforts have enjoyed unanimous support in Congress. And a number of the states have not waited for Washington, but have launched their own legislative initiatives in Maine and Virginia, Florida, Arizona. I just came back from Texas, where Senator Bob Hall has introduced a bill to try to protect the Texas grid from EMP, testified in support of his bill. So we're in much better shape than we were 8 years ago in terms of policy, okay, in terms of recognition of the threat, in terms of actually trying to do something about the threat. However, the sad fact is, all of these are policy victories, okay? None of them has yet. Well, in Maine and Virginia, those states, it has actually translated into actual protection of the grid. So some protection of the grid has actually begun too. However, even though these successes are very encouraging, the fact of the matter is the threat is continuing to outstrip, our preparations for it. During the same 8-year period, North Korea has become much more capable of delivering an EMP attack against us. I think we still have our head buried in the sand where Iran is concerned, where even many conservative Republicans, people who should know better, sort of go along, just accept at face value, it seems to me, the Obama administration intelligence community position that Iran doesn't have the bomb yet. And I and others have written, including many former senior national security experts from the Reagan years and even from the Clinton administration, like Ambassador Jim Woolsey, who was the director of the CIA under Bill Clinton. We think Iran has actually had the bomb and the ability to do an EMP attack probably since 2003. and that Iran is following the example of North Korea and concealing its nuclear program from us until it becomes so advanced that it becomes irreversible, just like the situation we have today. I mean, people seem to have forgotten that all through the Clinton administration for 8 years, remember when the press was praising Bill Clinton for his agreed framework with North Korea?
I was just about to ask you that. We've got a problem with North Korea now. Exactly. We've got a problem with North Korea now, and we're going to have the same situation with Iran thanks to this multi-billion-dollar deal that Barack Obama did. And, gee, nothing gets talked about as far as that's concerned. Don had a question for you, sir.
Well, basically what I wanted to ask you, Doctor, is if you would explain, because clearly there's two major EMP threats, that of a military action by a rogue country like North Korea or Iran. But there's also the very real possibility of a solar EMP. And would you mind explaining to the listening audience the difference between those two? Which is more severe? Which is more likely? I know that either one of them could be catastrophic to us if we're not prepared for it. But would you dive into that a little bit before we start jumping into Iran and North Korea and that threat?
Certainly. We know more now about the solar EMP threat, too, than we did 8 years ago. We've learned a lot about the threat from the sun, and it's worse than even the EMP Commission had originally suspected. You asked how likely it is. It's certain. It's a certainty. It's an inevitable. There will certainly be a recurrence of a Carrington-class natural EMP event. And
we're long overdue on that, are we not?
We are, and not only that, but we also now know that for long that geomagnetic superstorms more powerful than Carrington are possible. Carrington in 1859 was just the most powerful one on record, and the electric power industry liked to think that was the maximum threat. But it's not the maximum threat, and common sense should have told us that it wasn't the maximum threat. The only reason we know about Carrington is because it also happened in 1859. It's the first time we started deploying magnetometers. But the solar system, is 5 billion years old, and the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and the notion, now Carrington was only 150 years ago, so it really kind of strains credulity that we just would have happened to have had the most powerful possible solar storm at a time when we just started taking measurements 150 years ago. So that never made sense. And now we know, because we've put up satellites since 2008 that can look at the coronal mass ejections, which come out of the sun, which cause geomagnetic storms, geomagnetic superstorms. And we now know that Carrington-class coronal mass ejections and bigger ones are routine. They come out of the sun all the time. It's just we're sort of in a game of Russian roulette with the sun, and it's just a question of time before one of these things slams into us and causes another Carrington event, which would be, and what does that mean? The way this works, to talk about the physics for a moment so people will know what we're talking about. A coronal mass ejection, or sometimes in layman's terms they call it a solar flare, though that's not the proper scientific name for it. These things come out of the sunspots, on the sun, which are big holes in the magnetic fields of the sun, and they basically are like electromagnetic cannons, and a chunk of the sun will come out. It's a huge blob of ionized plasma, that's millions of degrees in temperature, and these things will be hurled out into space. And small coronal mass, relatively smaller coronal mass ejections hit the Earth every year and don't have much consequence. They cause geomagnetic storms of routine geomagnetic storms that'll cause problems with air travel and maybe some minor blackouts. Sometimes a little more serious than that. For example, there was a coronal mass ejection that caused in 1989 the Hydro-Quebec storm, which blacked out half of Canada for a day and even reached into the northern United States, caused some damage to our electric grid, including the melting of a extra high voltage transformer at the Salem nuclear plant in the United States. And these extra high voltage transformers are designed to carry 750,000 volts. Okay, 750,000 volts. Yet the transformer melted. in seconds. It gives you an idea of the power of the 1989 Tartu-Quebec storm, which was more than a usual. I mean, but that's not a Carrington event. Something like that is like 10% of what a Carrington event would be. And if we get hit with a repeat of the Carrington event, we know that that was a worldwide phenomenon. What happens is the coronal mass ejection. It's traveling 1 million miles an hour or faster. And the reason the Earth doesn't get burned to a crisp is we're surrounded by a magnetosphere, magnetic field, and this keeps the coronal mass ejection from actually reaching the Earth. But in the process of doing that, the magnetosphere gets distorted, it gets bent, and it wobbles around under the impact from the coronal mass ejection. And when it gets hit by a big enough one, like a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection, the magnetosphere everywhere goes wobbling around. And because you've got that moving magnetic field, that's what generates the electromagnetic pulse. It induces currents in wires on the Earth's surface and railroad tracks, pipelines, any large, long metal thing. In 1859, when it happened, the colonial powers had deployed telegraph systems all over the world. In China, India, in South Africa, America had deployed telegraph lines, and all over the world we had fires break out in telegraph stations or forced fires because the pulse was so powerful it would cause the telegraph line to burst into flames. The pulse from Carrington in 1859 was so powerful it reached down miles deep into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean and burned out the transatlantic telegraph cable, which had just been laid in 1859, and the Great Eastern had to go back and relay the cable again. Now, back in those days, electronic systems and telegraphy was not crucial to the existence of civilization in those horse and buggy days. But today it is. And today the electronics we depend upon are millions of times more vulnerable to EMP than the primitive electronics of 1859. And, if something like that happened today, it would cause the collapse of power grids all over the world. It would cause the collapse of the life-sustaining critical infrastructures that provide food and water and communications and transportation all over the world, and it would put billions of lives at risk. So some people consider the coronal mass ejection, the natural EMP threat, to be even worse than the nuclear EMP threat because it's inevitable. It will happen for sure. We're overdue for one. In fact, we were just missed by one on July 23rd, 2012. One missed us by about 3 days. That's how close we came, and so billions of lives are at risk because people can't live without these modern critical infrastructures, food and water.
Well, I think it's also safe to say that when you look at someone like North Korea or Iran, they are chump change to the sun.
Exactly.
And back in the 1800s when the Carrington event hit, very few people were actually affected by that. Many people in the United States, and I'm speaking specifically for the population of the United States at the time, but many people didn't even realize this took place. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And they knew a strange natural phenomenon was happening because the aurora borealis was so bright at night that you could read newspapers at night in London by the light of the aurora borealis. So people knew something strange had happened, but they didn't realize what it was.
And for the most part, they were able to.
The aurora borealis also showed up on the equator, which it rarely does. So the northern lights were seen in Hawaii, for example.
Wow. But for the most part, people were able to go on with their days. They were able to farm. They were able to eat and survive. Oh, yeah. And but I'm telling you, something like this happens now. There's not a person in the United States that would not be affected drastically by it. And if I'm not mistaken, something that you discussed last time, we're talking about the potential of like a 10% or less survival rate.
That's right. The Congressional EMP Commission assessed that if a nuclear EMP happened that caused a nationwide blackout, or if a nationwide blackout was caused by the sun or by any cause that deprived us of electricity for a year, that up to 9 of 10 Americans would die from starvation and disease and societal collapse. And a lot of people are, surprised at that, but it shouldn't be surprising. When you consider, that we have 320 million people in this country, and what was the ability to support a population before we had electricity? if you go back to 1910, the country wasn't really electrified until the Roosevelt administration. In 1910, we had a population of 100 million people. And those people, 75% of them were farmers, okay? And all of them were one generation removed at most from pioneer stock. So basically you had 100 million people in 1910 who were a nation of survivalists, all right? Today, less than 2% of our population feeds the other 98%, 320 million people. Most people don't know how to survive in the wilderness on their own. Immediately you lose the water supply. It requires vast amounts of electricity to purify and pump water. Food supply, we only have enough food to feed 320 million people for 30 days in the United States. And it will begin spoiling in 3 days, because of the emergency generators only have enough fuel to operate for 3 days. And then the food starts spoiling. How do you keep 320 million people alive with no food? How do you keep them alive with no water? And it's not like another misconception is that the EMP will basically return you to a pristine environment, like in the 1880s. So that, and some people foolishly think, oh, well, in some ways that might even be good, so that we could start over again in a more pristine environment. Not so. The EMP would cause an unprecedented environmental catastrophe. For example, the nuclear reactors. We have 100 nuclear reactors in this country. In 7 days, their emergency generating supplies run out. That keeps the reactor cores cool. And so in 7 days, you'd have 100 nuclear reactors going to Fukushima, spreading radioactivity over vast swaths of the United States. They happen to be co-located with most of our population. And gas pipelines would explode. You'd have firestorms in cities. All kinds of industrial facilities that rely on chemicals, processes that be toxic, poisonous clouds and chemicals dumped into streams and rivers and lakes. Most of our rivers and lakes are, even though we've had a lot of activity to purify them, it's still dangerous for us to drink that water. Likely, if you went and tried to drink from the river in your backyard, you'd probably get sick and possibly die from it. And it would be even worse in the aftermath of an EMP because the water purification plants tend to backflow when there's no electricity. So we have industrial and hospital wastes flowing back into the lakes and rivers. And we've gotten used to, the water that you drink out of your tap water, it's a 99.98% pure. That's what our bodies have become accustomed to over the generations since we've, been using the modern industrial purified water systems. That's purer than nature, okay? And from a technological point of view, that sounds like a good thing. But it means that we don't have the antibodies in our systems that our pioneer stock used to have. So we can't go back to 1880 and be drinking out of a normal stream that is as pure as Mother Nature, because we need 99.98% water. It's one of the perhaps unfortunate consequences of our advanced technology that we never gave much thought to, that if the system ever failed, we couldn't go back to living the way our ancestors did. So this is how, we come to the conclusion, and it's not hard to do when you consider the lack of food, the lack of water, the environmental consequences of an EMP, that, that 90% of the population, would likely perish as a consequence of a protracted nationwide blackout caused by EMP. And before we leave the topic of the naturally caused EMP from a solar storm versus the nuclear EMP, I do have to point out one important difference between them, because it's a lot of people, while the solar EMP, the natural EMP is worse in terms of the scale of the effects, because it would affect, if you're talking about a Carrington-class event or larger, it would affect the entire planet. And because it's inevitable, okay, people a lot of times assume that the natural EMP is worse. And in those respects, it is. But there's a characteristic about the nuclear EMP attack that Mother Nature can't do that makes it technically worse. The nuclear weapon produces something called an E1 EMP. In addition to the E3 EMP, the E3 EMP is what the natural EMP is, and it's a long wavelength phenomena. it requires a very big antenna to couple into. So it couples into railroad tracks and power lines, pipelines, and things like that. But it won't directly couple into your automobile, for example, or the personal computer on your desk, and the small electronics. The nuclear EMP produces this E3 EMP that couples into all these long wavelengths, long antennas. But it also produces this E1 EMP, which has a very short wavelength. It's only about a half a meter wide. And it'll couple into everything that's about that dimension or smaller. So if you've got a wire on your personal computer that's longer than a half a meter, it'll couple into that and put. It's also got the way we measure the power of EMP is the volts per meter. And in the case of, for example, a super EMP weapon, which is what we think North Korea has got, it generates 200,000 volts per meter, all right? So that means that if you have a wire going into your computer that's 1 meter long, it gets 200,000 volts injected to it in a billionth of a second. Not only will it fry it out, it could actually cause the thing to explode. Think of your car. Now, the natural EMP won't directly couple into your car because your car isn't big enough for the wavelength. But a nuclear EMP will. And suppose your car, typically 4 meters long, okay? So that's 4 times 200,000. So that's 800,000 volts. It connects, it couples into the body of your car, and will seek out pathways to get into the electronics. 800,000 volts. So that's so the nuclear EMP, while it won't cover the whole planet with one bomb, you can get a whole continent with one bomb. It does deeper damage. It does deeper damage than the EMP from the sun. So that it'll go in and directly destroy SCADAs, and that is supervisory control and data acquisition systems, and all these computers and microprocessors and other kinds of electronic components that are crucial to our modern society. Bottom line is that in 3 days you do end up in basically the same place. Even though your car might run for a while in the aftermath of a natural EMP, your car needs gas. And when the electric grid goes down, there won't be any gas anymore, because gas stations require electricity to run the pumps, and the pipelines require electricity for fuel to be delivered, to various gas stations and for transportation to run. So they're both existential threats to America.
Dr. Pry, hold that thought because we're going into a break, and when we come back, I want to get into what the EMP Commission is recommending and what the U.S. and we can do in the event of an EMP. We're talking with Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. He's the Chief of Staff of the EMP Commission, and he's written numerous books on this topic. It's frightening, but it's very real, and it's something we need to deal with. We'll have more coming up after the break on Cowboy Logic Radio.
Cowboys didn't dance, didn't wear designer shirts. Their hearts were filled with memories, their bodies filled with hurt. They would sit around the campfire.
You're listening to Red Nation Rising Radio, the new dominant force in conservative internet talk radio.
Hey everybody, they're back on again!
Cowboys didn't dance, didn't wear designer shirts. When their hearts were filled with memories, their bodies filled with hurt. They would sit around the campfire and exchange a piercing glance. Back when the West was really wild, cowboys didn't dance.
Welcome back to Cowboy Logic Radio. I'm Donna Fiducia, along with Don NEUEN, and our very special guest for this entire hour will be Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. We continue with our interview with him. He's Chief of Staff of the EMP Commission. He really is the foremost authority on electromagnetic pulses, and we got hold of you, Dr. Pry, through our good friend Frank Gaffney and Claire Lopez at the Center for Security Policy, because what you have to say needs to get out there on as many shows as possible. Dr. Pry is also the author of many books on the topic, including Blackout Wars, Apocalypse Unknown, and Electric Armageddon. Again, you can find them in all the usual spots. And Dr. Pry, just before the break, we were talking about or we're going to talk about what the EMP Commission is recommending and this E1 phenomenon, which is against a nuclear attack. Can you explain what the Commission feels we should be doing?
Well, hold on, Dr. Pry. Before you do that, I want to interject and interrupt something here. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you, if you didn't already do it in the last segment, get a pen and paper to where you're able to take notes, because Dr. Pry, I'm sure you will agree with me. In my opinion, this is the single greatest threat, not only toward the United States, but toward humanity. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the scary stuff that we talk about on this radio show, ladies and gentlemen. And Dr. Pry is the authority, hands down. We're talking to the expert, the number one guy in the entire, in this field. Take notes from what he's got to say in this last segment here, because this is terrifying. And it's how you can protect yourself against an electromagnetic pulse, if at all possible, as best as we can. All right, Dr. Pry, the commission, the E1 phenomenon against a nuclear attack, what does the commission actually recommend at this point?
Well, I would like to concur with what your co-host said to impress upon the audience that this is the biggest threat we need to worry about. It's a threat not just to the United States, but to civilization worldwide. And that is so, because we've never had a situation in history where society is basically now an electronic civilization. And we face two threat vectors, one from Mother Nature, from the sun, where in a geomagnetic superstorm, all the electronic systems, could go into blackout for a protracted period, and billions of people could be killed by a natural phenomena, which we have no way of stopping, and which is inevitable and is sure to happen. And in 2012, as I had mentioned earlier, nearly struck us. We escaped being struck by such a geomagnetic superstorm by just 3 days. And now, here we are on Easter Sunday, facing imminent threats from failed states like North Korea, who regularly threaten to attack us. We've never had a situation in history where the least successful societies on Earth, the most dysfunctional societies on Earth, like a North Korea that can't even feed its own people, yet they have the technology in their hands that with one EMP strike, they could destroy the most advanced societies on Earth. And this could be done by non-state actors too. Dystopian groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda could take down our civilization. So this is an enormous threat to us, the biggest threat that we face. And that's why I've dedicated my professional life, as have many other, senior, very senior people, much more senior than me, like my boss, Dr. William Graham, who's chairman of the Congressional EMP Commission and had been President Reagan's science advisor and director of NASA. And he wants to be in retirement, but he won't go into retirement because he's come back from retirement to be the chairman of the EMP Commission, because he knows what a threat this is. This is, he can't afford to relax and be with his grandchildren. Certainly he has earned that right. But as long as we are vulnerable to this, he's doing what he can to stop it. Or Jim Woolsey, who was a former director of the CIA, and yet I can call Jim and he will show up to speak publicly on this, because they know what a serious threat this is, that this is the threat. Now, getting to what the Commission recommends, our core recommendation was that we protect the electric grid and other critical infrastructures against nuclear EMP attack because of all the EMP threats we've been talking about, whether it's from the sun or whether it's from non-nuclear EMP weapons. The nuclear EMP threat is the hardest to defend against because of that E1 EMP and the E3 EMP. In other words, it does the same thing that a geomagnetic superstorm would do, but it also does something even worse with this electromagnetic shock wave that it puts out, that on top of destroying very large grid systems, communication systems, and being able to couple into railroad tracks and the like, the electromagnetic shock wave that a nuclear weapon puts out, unlike the geomagnetic storm, can do things like destroy your car so your car won't start, take out the personal computer on your desk, take out all kinds of small electronics as well. So it does much deeper damage. And if you're protected against that, it will mitigate, the worst case solar storm threat. And it will also mitigate all other threats to the grid. You could take the grid down by cyber attacks, for example. You don't need a nuclear weapon to take down the electric grid and kill most Americans. But if you're protected against a nuclear EMP attack, it will mitigate cyber threats as well. It will mitigate physical sabotage. One of the things terrorists could do, there's a handful of extra high voltage transformer substations. We know because the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission did a study, that warned that if terrorists knew which 9 out of 2,000 EHV transformer substations to attack, they could take down the whole grid for 18 months and kill 9 of 10 Americans. But if you're protected against a nuclear EMP attack, it will also take that threat off the table. And severe weather, for example, hurricanes and tornadoes and things like that can cause localized blackouts, would also be mitigated by nuclear EMP protection. And perhaps I should take a moment to explain why that is so and how that works, because people may have a difficult time imagining, well, why, when you're protecting against nuclear EMP, how does that protect you against, say, terrorists who are taking high explosives or a machine gun or something to shoot up an EHV transformer? How could hardening against EMP protect you against that? Well, this is the problem. When you make the way a cyber attack or the way a physical act of physical sabotage would work, the way it would take the grid down, is that you're not attacking all the transformers at once in the case of a cyber attack or in the case of an act of physical sabotage. To take the easiest thing to understand, suppose you blew up those 9 EHV transformer substations. The mechanism by which the whole grid gets taken out is when those transformers are gone, the energy that was going through those transformers has to go somewhere, so it gets dumped on neighboring transformers. So you're talking about, one transformer, a big transformer is carrying 750,000 volts. So you're suddenly dumping all that load, from 9 big transformers onto neighboring transformers, and it's too much. They can't handle it, and so they will go out, and their load has to go someplace. So you get a cascading failure that ends up rippling through the whole grid. And you can begin that cascading failure either by sabotage or by a cyber attack that would take out the small number of transformers to begin that process. But suppose you had protected all the transformers from EMP, nuclear EMP, by putting surge arresters on those transformers. And what a surge arrestor does is when it depicts, a surge of energy, whether it's from EMP or something else, any kind of overvoltage, coming in, it cuts it off, it stops it so it doesn't get into the transformer. And so those 9 transformers that get blown up either by cyber or taken down by physical sabotage, the overvoltage that's coming out of that, when the load gets dumped, it gets stopped. It would get stopped by the surge arresters on neighboring transformers, and it would stop in its tracks the cascading failure that those attack modes depend upon. Similarly, if you look at, take an example of hurricanes. Hurricane Sandy, for example. I think you can Google it online. Somebody used their cell phone to take a picture at night from New Jersey in the middle of Hurricane Sandy because people didn't know what was going on, but there was this dramatic effect happening where there were these brilliant blue flashes all around the horizon, enormous blue flashes, and people were just in awe of them. They didn't know what it was. Well, what those were transformers blowing up, because as a hurricane knocks down the high-voltage power lines, the energy has to go somewhere. And so it backs up into the transformers and causes them to have overvoltages, and they blow up. And this is one of the things that makes it so hard to recover from a hurricane, because you're losing all these transformers that have to be replaced when they blow up like that. All kinds of transformers. However, if you had surge arresters, again, on the transformers to protect them from a nuclear EMP, there is no overvoltage, no system-generated overvoltage that could be caused by a cyber attack or by sabotage or by a hurricane that is greater, more powerful than what you'd get from a nuclear EMP. And once again, the surge arrestor would interrupt those overvoltages and stop them dead in their tracks so you don't lose the transformers. And you don't lose the SCADAs and other electronics as well that are necessary to the grid. And this makes grid recovery much, much easier.
Dr. Pryde, let me ask you a very quick question with regard to this protection. In the past conversations that we've had with you, that we've had with Claire Lopez, this is the protection of our grid in the scheme of an annual budget or in the scheme of government spending is microscopic, is it not?
It is. Now you'll have there are differences over that, okay? Because, some people will claim that there are different plans out there for protecting the grid. The EMP Commission plan, the EMP Commission estimated that you could protect the national electric grid for just $2 billion. That's what we give away in foreign aid to Pakistan every year. $2 billion. So if we suspended foreign aid to Pakistan, and I don't even know why we give foreign aid to Pakistan. They're a nuclear weapon state. They hate the United States. They harbored Osama bin Laden. They could protect the Taliban. But we give them $2 billion every year in military and foreign aid. We suspended foreign aid to Pakistan for just 1 year and spent it on the security of the American people. We could solve this problem and take an enormous step towards solving this problem by protecting the electric grid. Now there are other competing estimates. I think the EMP Commission estimate is the best and the sound estimate. But I have colleagues who I respect who would like to spend $20 billion protecting the grid, and I would support that. Too. It's just a question of how much do you need to spend. Okay, you can buy. How much security do you want to buy?
There are basically
I get asked
three.
all the time.
But
if I could,
okay.
Well, let me continue for a moment. I want to finish this thought. Because when you ask someone, well, how much does it cost to protect the electric grid from an EMP or from any phenomenon? It's not necessarily all that simple a question. To use an example, suppose someone asked you, well, how much does it cost to protect your house against fire? Okay? There's a lot of answers to that, all of them valid. You could, if your house had no protection at all, you could start by spending $20 to put a smoke alarm in your house. And if you only did that alone would greatly increase the likelihood that your family would survive. But you might want to buy even more security and buy a fire extinguisher to put in the kitchen and another one to put in the garage. You might want to buy even more security and have a sprinkler system put in the whole house. And obviously, as you increase these purchases, you're buying more and more security. So, which is ultimately a political question about how much security do you want to buy. The EMP Commission thought installing surge arresters and blocking devices in Faraday cages to protect the generators and the big HV transformers and these control centers would be good enough, and we can do that for $2 billion. Other of my colleagues, but that does depend on relying on the utilities to have contingency plans so that there are things that utilities actually have to do to bring the grid back and to protect the grid. And if they're trained to do that and they're smart enough to do that, then you can spend $2 billion.
All right, what I wanted to ask you real quick, though, you have three separate sections. You have the eastern, the western grid, and you have Texas. That $2 billion is basically what you're saying to protect those three big areas. Then smaller companies like our own here outside Atlanta, Carroll EMC, electric co-op that they have, they need to put their own surge protectors in, correct? I mean, and it can be done. What Claire Lopez told us in general for the $2 billion at least might raise your electric bill a couple dollars a month. And that's a small price to pay.
It would be less than that. Mm-hmm. The U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission estimated that it would raise the average ratepayer's annual electric bill to something like a quarter per year. To pay for that. There are more ambitious plans that like the $20 billion plan. Would cost maybe a couple of bucks a year. And what the $20 billion plan does, and I'm not against the $20 billion plan. I'm not criticizing. It's a good plan too. And if society were willing to spend the $20 billion, I would advocate that. But what that does is it brings the grid up to military standards. Okay, this basically would take the human decision. You don't have to rely on the utilities knowing anything or doing anything anymore. Basically, that's a plan from one of my colleagues from Dr. George Baker, who did military hardening for the military. And the military doesn't like to trust the human factor, okay? They just want to harden things so hard that you don't have to worry about it anymore. It'll just survive no matter what, even if there's human error. So if you're spending 10 times as much, you basically don't have to rely on the utilities to know anything about EMP or do anything. It'll just survive because it's so hardened and everything has been thought through so well, in effect designed by geniuses to be used by idiots, that that basically you don't need the utilities to know anything about EMP. It'll just survive anyway.
But the technology is there. The technology is there, and why aren't they doing it?
This is the biggest no-brainer in the history of man, in my opinion. First of all, the federal government is charged with protecting the citizens of the United States. This is a no-brainer to me. Let me ask you this: who are the lobbyists that have been preventing this from happening for decades?
Well, the big one is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, and they are supposed to partner with the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, called FERC, to protect the grid. The problem is that the electric power industry is the last critical infrastructure in this society which basically regulates itself. It's operating in a 19th century regulatory environment where we trust the electric power industry to regulate itself. And the U.S. FERC has no legal authorities to order the electric grid to protect itself. And NERC, while it pretends that it's a partner and that its highest priority is electric reliability and public safety, in fact, they're in effect a lobby for all the 3,000 utilities, and they basically don't want to spend money on anything. They want to keep the costs as low as possible so that they don't have to spend. And this is, an inevitable consequence of. I'm a Tea Party Republican. I don't believe in big government. I believe in the private sector. I believe in free enterprise system as the best system ever conceived of by man for delivering goods and services at the lowest possible price. And the founders all believed that as well. But the founders also understood that you can't trust the free enterprise system to provide for national security and public safety. That is why we have government. This is the role that government has. Government takes a longer view than the merchant does. When that merchant has got that dollar of profit in his hands, and he's thinking about, well, do I put this in my pocket, or do I spend it on protecting against a once-in-100-year geomagnetic superstorm, or the possibility of a North Korean nuclear EMP attack? He's always going to put that dollar in his pocket. He answers to his stockholders, and his view is a shorter view, and his motives. He's not coming out of a warrior culture. He's coming out of business culture. They don't think about these things the way the CIA does or the Department of Defense, which is why we have them. To provide for the common defense in the Constitution, that's not the job of the electric utilities. The common defense is supposed to be provided by the U.S. government and by our departments of defense and our intelligence communities that are organized for that. The problem is we've got this dilemma.
Well, last half hour, you said that it was we made a bit of progress at the governmental level. I believe it's Congressman McCall who is the head of that particular branch of whatever section they call it. Is that the EMP Commission for Congress? I don't even know what it is, but or the Homeland Security.
Well, it was the passage. Chairman McCall, who's the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, and Chairman Ron Johnson, the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and Trent Franks, who actually the bill actually originally came from him, have been enormous heroes in this. And last year they passed the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, which is an enormous step in the right direction toward getting the country protected. It requires the Department of Homeland Security to launch pilot programs, to educate industry, to reach out to industry, to do everything that is legally possible, to protect the electric grid. But still, it doesn't have provisions because it's not legally. No body of government has the regulatory capability to order the utilities to actually protect their assets. So that's a shortcoming. You can lead a horse to water. Can we make them drink?
Exactly.
It's not just EMP. Even I may have used this example. I can't remember if we did in the first section, but take the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003. Mm-hmm. That was caused by a falling tree branch that hit a high power voltage line, and it put 50 million Americans into the dark for a day, and some people died. Some people died as a result of the blackout, okay? And the U.S. government said to the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, This is unacceptable. We can't have a situation where 50 million Americans are put into the dark by a falling tree branch. So talk to the NERC and fix this problem. And U.S. FERC went on its hands and knees to the NERC and told them, look, please come up with a proposal, find a way to fix this problem. You know how long it took them to come up with what's called an improved vegetation management plan? A decade. It wasn't until 2013 that they had a better plan for protecting against falling tree branches. And their attitude hasn't been any better against cyber attacks or sabotage or EMP. In fact, they don't want to do anything about these other threats. They claim, well, this is the job of the Department of Defense. And we've actually had people from the utility lobbying groups like the Edison Electric Institute testify before Congress that it's not their job to harden the grid, but the preferable solution would be for the Department of Defense to launch preemptive wars against countries like Iran and North Korea to stop them from attacking us in the first place. Now, certainly in extremis, I would advocate that we'd have to do whatever is necessary, including a preemptive war. But the first order of business for solving this problem ought not to be for Americans to have to send their sons and daughters to die in foreign wars. I think we've had enough of those already, just because the electric power industry doesn't want to raise rates by 25 cents a year, for the average consumer to protect the electric grid.
It's appalling. This is appalling.
The government can't force them to do it, though, at this point?
Here's the thing. Ladies and gentlemen, do you understand that what Dr. Pry is talking about, if it were to happen, the only peoples that I'm aware of on the globe that would survive this type of a thing and be able to continue with their with living are people like in the jungles of South America, the jungles of of Africa, and if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Pry, Iran. Don't they have their grid protected in Iran?
Russia and China have hardened their grid, and Iran.
That's great.
And Iran is starting to.
Oh, good.
It's just appalling.
Yeah.
Dr. Pry, we have gotten very close to running out of time here, sir. Let me ask you this. What can the listeners do to help you and help themselves with this? What can they do?
I wouldn't wait for Washington. I mean, we are making progress in Washington, but most progress has been made at the level of the states. Individual states can protect their grids, even though they're part of a larger grid, by installing the blocking devices, the surge arresters. I would encourage your listeners to reach out to their governor, reach out to their state legislature, urge them to do what they're trying to do in Texas, and what they have done in Maine and Virginia and Arizona and Florida, and pass a bill where that's going to require the utility, because they do have the legal authorities, by the way. I mean, this is very important. While those legal authorities don't exist at the federal level, at the level of the states, the state public service commissions do have the power to order the utilities to protect themselves. So that's one of the reasons we've been making more progress at the level of the states. And there's another angle to this, and this is my personal view. It's not the official view of the Congressional EMP Commission, okay? But I think there's an additional reason for people to be activists and to try to get a solution going at the level of the states as well. I mean, I think not just the failure to protect against EMP, but a lot of the problems that have come out of our society are because the concept of federalism, as it was originally conceived by the founders, has been perverted so that everybody thinks Washington has to solve all the major problems of the society. That's not how the society was originally conceived. The Constitution originally conceives the notion that the most governance should be at the level of the states. I mean, since there seems to be this power vacuum of competency and initiative at the level of Washington, if the states step into that vacuum and fill it and start making important decisions like this to protect their people on their own, it could be the beginning of a second American Revolution, where we restore the legitimate balance between the central power in Washington and the states. If the states empower themselves by reaching out and saying, we're not waiting for you, Washington, we're going to act on our own and protect ourselves, this could be the beginning of a very important trend in many areas, where power could devolve to the states as the founders originally intended it to.
Amen to that. Real quick, Dr. Pry, if everything went beautifully and they said we could protect the grid and we're starting to do this right away, how long would it take to happen with your $2 billion projection of how that you want things protected?
Well, the commission envisioned moving at a normal kind of at a pace where you would be replacing things at the normal replacement rate. Okay, so as SCADAs need to be replaced, you replace them with an EMP hardened SCADA, and if you did it on a non-rushed basis like that, on a normative basis, it would take about 3.5 years to get all the protections in place. I think the situation, now that was the commission view back in 2008. You know, the threat has evolved considerably since then. Mm-hmm. You know, the view now is that we need something like a Manhattan Project. You know, we need to move much faster. And a lot of very important things, you couldn't do everything, but a lot of things could be done that could save tens of millions of lives if we acted in 6 months. For instance, you know, there's about of the 2,000 transformers, you know, there's about 400 of them that are absolutely indispensable and that service the major metropolitan areas. You know, we should have a crash program to at least protect those. You know, that could be done for $200 million to protect those 400 transformers. That would give us a fighting chance to save most of the people who would die who are located in, you know, the major metropolitan areas.
Yeah, a small price to pay. Well, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, we're actually well over time, and it's worth it, though. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Again, Chief of Staff of the EMP Commission. You really need to find out about this, folks, to protect yourself if the government's not going to do it. And the best thing, as he says, is to go to your state legislature, your local folks as well, your local, possibly electronic cooperatives that we have here as well in Georgia. And you gotta try to get them to move, because time at this point is of the essence. And North Korea, with all the saber rattling and the problems with Iran, only hopefully won't wake us up too late. It'll wake us up in time. That's all we can pray. Dr. Pry, thank you so much for joining us. We will post your books, by the way, on our website as well. And again, God bless you. God bless the work you do. God bless America, everyone. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Logic Radio. We'll see you next week. And again, have a great week. Be happy, be safe. Again, one more time, can't say it enough. God bless America.
Cowboys didn't dance, didn't wear designer shirts. Their hearts were filled with memories, their bodies filled with hurt. They would sit around the campfire and exchange a piercing glance. Back when the West was really wild, cowboys didn't dance, yes. When cowboys didn't dance, didn't wear designer shirts. When their hearts were filled with memories, their bodies filled with hurt. They would sit around the campfire and exchange a piercing glance. Back when the West was really wild, cowboys didn't dance.
Check us out on the web at cowboylogic.us.